In Essential Task 8.6, we are going to describe the subdivisions and functions of the peripheral nervous system. I think vertical works the best for today's concept map. As you see, it is a very vertically aligned concept map. It's 5 total boxes with 3 different levels. In order to put into context the peripheral nervous system, I think it's important to zoom back out and look at the overall heading of the nervous system. In doing so, you will see the 8.5A, B, and C sequence that we previously talked about, all falling under the central nervous system. Again, those are the neurons in the brain and spinal cord. Today, we're going to talk about the neurons and the neural connections outside of the brain and spinal cord, indicated in the diagram to the right. You can see here all of these blue neural connections throughout the body. These are the neural connections that we are going to talk about today, comprising the peripheral nervous system. I will allow you to pause the video here before proceeding into the concept map. We'll start all the way at the top and define the peripheral nervous system. As I sort of just alluded to, all of the sensory neurons and motor neurons outside of the brain and spinal cord are part of the peripheral nervous system. So, for example, in order to lift up a pen, I would be utilizing motor neurons in my arm. Those motor neurons are part of the peripheral nervous system. In order to feel the touch sensation on the palm of my hand, there are sensory neurons in and around the palm of my hand, which are currently being stimulated. Those sensory neurons are part of the peripheral nervous system. Now, granted, to put this into a bigger picture, eventually that information will be sent through sensory neurons up to the brain, where it will be processed in the somatosensory cortex. That is the central nervous system where it's ultimately processed. But receiving that information is going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. The word peripheral itself, by definition, means on the sides. And I think whenever you look at a visual of the peripheral nervous system, it very much is the neurons sort of all over the sides, in your limbs, your legs. Some of them go all the way up to your face technically, but they are not in the brain or spinal cord. From that point, the peripheral nervous system is broken up into a few different subdivisions, and then the subdivision autonomic is broken down one more time. The sequence here is going to seem a little bit weird because we're actually going to go and talk about the somatic nervous system first, because that box is in isolation and there's no secondary level. And then we're going to go right to left into the autonomic nervous system. So we're about to transition not left to right like we always do. We're actually going to transition here. I do that because the diagram itself and sort of the way its arm extends outward, I think this looks the best. So it's contrary to how we normally do concept maps, but we're going to go right to left. The motor neurons throughout your body that enable movement are part of the somatic nervous system, and they are voluntary, meaning you can, at any given point, choose to control neurons that are part of the somatic nervous system. So when I pick up this pen, I'm voluntarily doing so. The motor neurons that are facilitating this motor movement are part of my somatic nervous system. If they are voluntary movements, they are part of your somatic nervous system. I cannot sit here today voluntarily control the neurons responsible for example, my heartbeat, or voluntarily control, for example, the neurons responsible for my breathing. Those are going to be different neurons in our body. The somatic nervous system are the neurons that facilitate motor movements that are voluntary, that you actively decide to do and that you voluntarily can trigger. So if you, for example, got up to go get a sandwich, you got up and go to the fridge, you got up to turn the lights off, you got up to check your phone, all of those are going to involve voluntary movements of walking and picking things up and opening a drawer or opening a door. All of those are examples of movement enabled by the somatic nervous system and the motor neurons in our body that we have voluntary control over. But there are also other neurons in our body. A variety of the neurons in our body produce automatic bodily functions that we do not readily sit here and control. Those are part of what are called the autonomic nervous system. These are responsible for automatic behind-the-scenes functions like heartbeat and digestion. Others can include blood pressure and others. What's important here is that these terms, or these functions, heartbeat, breathing, digestion, are ones that we saw earlier when we talked about the medulla in the brain. These are a lot of some automatic vital functions, but don't get confused here. The medulla might be what facilitates the neural activations necessary to regulate heartbeat, but it is the autonomic nervous system in these neural connections that actually extend to those parts of the body, whether it's the heart or lungs, to actually facilitate these behaviors. One of the things that is important to note here is that the autonomic nervous system is, as the name suggests, automatic. These are functions that are controlled outside of voluntary control, unlike the somatic nervous system that we talked about over to the right. When I look at the word autonomic, the word auto stands out. I connect obviously auto and autonomic with auto and automatic. It's important to note that we are not actively controlling autonomic function. It happens behind the scenes automatically. You may be familiar with what is called typically a lie detector test, or more formally a polygraph test. These are designed to hopefully potentially determine if somebody is lying within the criminal justice field. It should be noted, though, that a polygraph test really just measures autonomic nervous system changes. So it can determine whether or not your heartbeat's changing, your blood pressure, these types of body temperature. However, dishonesty or lying itself is not something that always registers the exact same way on a polygraph test. There are other physical states, like excitement, quite frankly, that might also trigger similar changes on an autonomic level. So dishonesty itself is not the only cause of autonomic changes, and as a result, polygraph tests are extremely unreliable. They're actually not admissible in court because of how unreliable that they are. Yes, technically, if you're lying, there are some behind the scenes changes that might occur. The problem is those changes are not exclusive to dishonesty and lying. They could also be autonomic changes that would occur when you're excited or maybe even just nervous. So unfortunately, we don't have a definitive way to determine if somebody is lying. But if you're curious, the polygraph tests are directly connected to the autonomic nervous system. From that point on, we have two final subdivisions in today's concept map. They are both within the autonomic nervous system. Each of these boxes is a little bit taller than typical, so do leave some space to proceed downward. The first is called the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is a subdivision of the autonomic nervous system that is active when you are aroused or expending energy. So, for example, your fear response would be a great example of a real-life event or circumstance which might trigger sympathetic nervous system arousal. The sympathetic nervous system would be active when you are expending energy. For example, running away from a bear would be a great example of a behavior which would require activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And again, it's a subdivision of the autonomic nervous system, so these are things that happen behind the scenes. For example, here are some bodily changes that occur when your sympathetic nervous system is active, and it is important to copy each of these down. When a bear walks into the class and your body automatically responds behind the scenes, there are a few different things that are going to happen to potentially put your body into the best state possible to survive the encounter. Your pupils are going to dilate, which means the black part of the eyes get bigger. We'll talk more about why that happens in Unit 10 when we talk about the eyes. Your heartbeat's going to increase, get blood pumping. Your digestion is going to slow automatically. Why, you might ask? Well, digestion all of a sudden takes a back seat when your bear walks into the class. Certainly digesting lunch isn't as important as perhaps increasing your heart rate or perhaps increasing your breathing so that we can get oxygen into your lungs and actually run away from the bear. Why expend body energy on digestion? This is not the time for that. The bladder relaxes, which makes it less likely for you to go to the bathroom, and your adrenaline typically increases as well. These are all things that happen behind the scenes. Now, it should be noted, adrenaline itself is something that is a hormone and is facilitated by the endocrine system, not precisely just exclusively the sympathetic nervous system, but I do like to list it here because it is one of the changes that would likely happen in the midst of a fear response. Increase in breathing is another one here that we could list as well. These are all what we call the fight or flight response. We've used that term a few times throughout the year. As a mnemonic here, there's actually nothing listed on this box, but I'm going to provide a mnemonic for the parasympathetic nervous system in just a moment. That one I think is really good, and then you can use process of elimination to differentiate the sympathetic from the parasympathetic. Because as you might anticipate, these two are very easily confused with one another. They both have the word sympathetic in there. So let's talk about the parasympathetic. Parasympathetic nervous system does the complete opposite. It facilitates automatic, again, it's part of the autonomic nervous system, automatic functions behind the scenes that help relax or, in some cases, simply save energy. They could also theoretically be active when you're coming down from the fight or flight response, or you're relaxing after being amped up from perhaps an encounter with a bear. So when we talked a moment ago about pupils dilating and about heart rate increasing, we're basically going to do all the opposite. When the parasympathetic nervous system is active, your heartbeat or your heart rate's going to drop. Your breathing is probably going to drop. And now all of a sudden, things like digestion become exponentially more important. Your body is going to be way more likely to digest food when the parasympathetic nervous system is active. Your body, looking at the circumstances, allocates resources so that you can focus on digestion. No longer do you need to focus on increased heart rate. The bear is no longer there. The bear is no longer present. We're now into a position to rest and digest. Your bladder will also contract, which will actually make it more likely for you to need to use the restroom. If you've ever felt like you just laid down to start relaxing and very soon after you needed to use the restroom, well, it's because once you start relaxing, your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. And there are all these neural activities going on behind the scenes that you're not voluntarily controlling. Again, it's still a subdivision of the autonomic. You're not voluntarily controlling any of this. That are, as you are sitting there relaxing, making it more likely for you to need to use the restroom. As a mnemonic in here, this is what I was alluding to a moment ago. When I look at the word para, there's a couple different possible mnemonics that you can use to differentiate the parasympathetic from the sympathetic nervous system. And I cannot stress enough, the College Board loves to include these on the AP exam. They are so easy to confuse with one another. I take the PARA out of sympathetic. That's really the only thing we have to work with. So the para out of parasympathetic. And I think of a parachute. If you think about a parachute, what it does is it brings you down slowly, calmly, smoothly. Well, the parasympathetic nervous system is the subdivision of the autonomic nervous system that is going to calm you down with behind-the-scenes functioning, like lowering your heartbeat and lowering your breathing and increasing your digestion. So when you use this as a mnemonic, all you have to do is isolate that word para, think about a parachute, P-A-R-A, bringing you down slowly, and then you have easily divided up the parasympathetic into the one that calms you down, and then process of elimination, sympathetic is simply the opposite. The sympathetic is the one that's going to amp you up, increase your breathing, increase your heart rate, etc.